Hello. Hello and welcome. Welcome in the room and welcome online, and welcome to all of you who are going to be viewing this sometime after this evening on our YouTube channel. My name is Reverend Lara Cowton, and I'm honored to be serving the Vancouver Unitarians as the interim minister during the time of transition here. We have the privilege of hosting this event from our sanctuary on the corner of Oak and 49th in Vancouver, which we recognize is on the unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nations people. With respect for the rights and wisdom of Indigenous people, we acknowledge our harmful colonial histories and present-day responsibility to honor, protect, and sustain this land, and to work as allies and witnesses to the ongoing struggle of the First Nations people. We are grateful for Indigenous wisdom and the worldviews that center the life-sustaining forces of the natural world, and relationships of reciprocity with the land and with people. Vancouver Unitarians are committed to learning new ways of being in community, in better relationship with Indigenous people and this land itself. On a beautiful spring day like this, who enjoyed the sunshine today? Yeah. Got a hoot from up in the sound booth there. On days like this, we are invited to deeply appreciate the wonders of nature, as well as the fragility of life, and how all things are connected. The Vancouver Unitarians have a long history of being deeply engaged in environmental issues and have partnered with people from many other faith traditions and community organizations to actively address the climate crisis. And I know that's why you are joining us this evening. We are called to this work as people of faith, driven by the principle that we hold to affirm and promote the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Our faith insists that care for the environment is a religious duty, and we recognize our mutual responsibility as stewards of our planet. This evening is the fourth in our series, the Faith, Spirit, and Climate Dialogues series that has been initiated by our social justice team. And I'm delighted to be here with you this evening. And I thank you for being here. And I welcome all of our guests and viewers, and I especially welcome our special guest speaker, Sukhvinder Kaur Vinning, a practicing Sikh and an influential diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. We have some interesting activities and conversation that Sukhvinder is going to lead us in this evening, and I'm excited to learn about her learnings and what she's going to share with us, the teachings and perspectives on mobilizing for the climate crisis. Our facilitators, Olivia Hall and Michael Clegg, will give us a proper introduction of Sukhvinder in a moment and lead our discussion, and you all online are invited to tap actively into the chat to share comments as we go forward. And with that, I will pass it over to our trusty leaders here, Olivia and Michael. Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks, Reverend Lara. And thank all of you for being here online and the smattering we have in person. I would like to acknowledge UCV volunteers and staff for helping put this event on every month, and also our co-sponsors of the series, the Multi-Faith Action Society, and our media sponsor, the Tyee. So thank you to those organizations as well. Now I think you should be able to see a slide. It'll be over here for those in person, and online you should be able to see it too, a slide of our future events and future speakers. So mark those in your calendars. The next one will be really exciting. It will be 4 of the members of our congregation who've been arrested at the TMX pipeline site. But for now, I want to turn it over to Michael to explain a bit more about the series as a whole.
Thank you, Olivia. How did we arrive at this point? Well, the series is wanting specifically to ask, can faith and secular values, what contribution can they make to the climate crisis discussion and debate? In the sense that there's a good deal, almost overwhelming amount of information about climate change and the climate crisis around. But where are the forums, where are the opportunities to say, well, I want to understand this more personally. I get pretty upset and anxious about what I hear that's going on. And how do I build and maintain my own resilience? Who do I look to for support? If I have a faith, what does my faith offer me? But similarly, are there challenges for my faith, and as well as for me in trying to maintain my equilibrium and to be an active contributor to action on the climate crisis? That's the sense of it, of what we're trying to do here, is to bring a dimension that I don't see a lot of discussion about. And of course, as we progress, I'm afraid the crises just keep adding up. We're coming out of the pandemic, we hope. We are entering the climate crisis, and we are now, our friends in Europe and in Ukraine are now at war. This is a lot of emotion, a lot of emotional overload to cope with, so it makes what we're looking at here tonight all the more germane.
Mm-hmm. The procedure for tonight is a little bit different than it has been in the past. While we are having a speaker and then a short Q&A, our speaker, Sukhvinder, is going to be offering us food for thought, offering us questions for reflection, and then asking us to reflect in pairs. If you are online and you're watching this with someone, you can chat and reflect together. You can also put things in the YouTube chat and respond to each other there. And I will be timekeeping throughout that, so you will hear a lot of me saying, "Time's up." And Sukhvinder will be guiding us through each of those reflection sessions.
Can I just add that the purpose of tonight is that we want to do transformation. Okay, so I didn't want to lecture you. I didn't want this to be a passive, one-way sort of flow of information. What I wanted is for everyone to reflect and do, like you're going to be working on yourself. And you're partnered up here physically, and if you're online, we're asking you to be very active in the chat, to share your thoughts with each other. And so the questions are there to guide us on a journey. So the idea is by the end of tonight, there should be a shift. There should be a spark of something that is different than when you arrived today. That's the hope.
So, to provide a bit more background about our speaker, Sukhvinder Kaur Vinning is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. She works with decision makers to build cultures of equity and respect with diverse colleagues, staff, clients, and stakeholders. She is passionate about decolonizing societal systems and is developing non-colonial systems and relationships with Indigenous communities. Sukhvinder has years of experience in fostering trust and understanding and collaborates with partners from diverse backgrounds to catalyze positive social change rooted in leadership of self. She is working on how to respond to climate change in a non-colonial way and create measurable change, and brings an extensive interfaith background to her work. And may I just add to this that fittingly, when we began the series with Seth Klein, who wrote his very important book on the subject of the climate crisis, and in that book he speaks to the issue of colonization and decolonization, particularly with respect to Indigenous people and the resource extraction industry. So it's a theme that is very much within our purview. I'm delighted to introduce you. It's over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to go grab my laptop. So I wanted to quickly first acknowledge, look, we've got roughly about an hour, and we've got a lot to do. So this talk is not going to be about defining like a box that we're going to all conform to. It is not about giving you definitive answers and certainty. Tonight is about asking questions of ourselves. It's about exploration. It's more about being intrigued and curious rather than trying to find that box to conform to. So everything I speak about, it would be, if you're going to make assumptions, it's better to assume that the idea is like an iceberg and we're just getting the tip of it, rather than it's this small piece that you're walking away with certainty. So with decolonization, there's so many definitions, and so I don't want to actually get into all the different viewpoints, just acknowledging that there's a very diverse interpretation of decolonization, and what I tend to focus on is the more practical side of decolonization, rather than the more philosophical side. So it's focusing on the habits and mindsets that make it possible for one group of people to oppress another, right? It's about examining how disconnection is really important for colonization to work. And so connection is important for decolonization. And colonization really relies heavily on people buying into an ideology and believing in the mindset of I'm right, you're wrong, and setting themselves up into adversarial dynamics. And the climate change movement has a lot of colonial habits when it's about I'm right, you're wrong, my carbon footprint is better than your carbon footprint. And there's this concept of sin that has really started to permeate throughout climate change ideology. And victim Olympics. That's like a good, really good pillar of colonization, because it's about encouraging people to compete. You know, I'm the bigger victim, and then they'll busy suppress each other to compete for whatever resource there is, or attention, or help, or support, etc. And so a lot of conversations in many spheres, including climate change, are around this idea of who deserves this the most? Who's the neediest? And setting up that mentality. So it's like if we're aware of this, then we have the opportunity to change it, right? It's our lack of awareness that means that good-intentioned individuals are part of actually a colonial response to climate change. And so I encourage you, rather than looking at it as from a sin concept or I'm wrong or I'm not perfect, instead just kind of go, hey, I'm an imperfect person. And if I'm aware of something, I have the ability to go, hold on a second, I think I accidentally went down a path I didn't want to go. So let me take a step back and let's try this again. That's, I feel, a far more practical mindset than to be sitting there in shame and guilt and self-flogging and like how we're just failures and it's hopeless. Like, that's a downward spiral, I think, that it's hard to get out of. So tonight, as I said earlier, is about transformation. So you're not going to transform by the end of the evening. That I'm not promising at all. What my hope is that there's a spark, and that as you go back into your life, you take this and you explore this, and there's shifts and changes that will happen in the conversations you have after tonight. So the talk I have, and the other thing I want to acknowledge is over the last 15 years or so, I've been engaged and observing also the climate change movement, and I'm very concerned, which is why I've taken the angle of my contribution to be what it is to climate change, because I've been concerned about, can I say, some of the ugly behaviors in climate change. We have our climate change missionaries now. You know, it used to be kind of like, here's this concept and we're going to do what's right, and it's turned into it's a religion for some. And I look at them and I'm like, wow, you sound like a lot of the missionaries that went around the world and, you know, colonized our countries, including the land that my family's from. So there is this, like, I want to bring that to our awareness so that if you get yourselves caught up in these conversations, that you start to pay attention and go, is this person being a climate change missionary? Because the missionary's idea is to sell an idea, and often by saying they're wrong, we're right. So be aware of that, of the people that instigate those kinds of dynamics, and the ones that are convinced they know how to save us all. I'm telling you, some of them are pretty vicious. Like, they are so convinced that they've got the answers. And unfortunately, so much harm is done because they're not listening to any other ideas because they feel they have the one way, the right way. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of spaces in climate change. So be aware of that. And you can help shift that just by choosing to respond to it differently rather than swallowing it, wholesale. You can start asking questions and start framing your responses from a place of, I wonder what other possible ideas there are. I wonder if, what are the different perspectives? Like, try to bring more diversity and curiosity into that conversation rather than that kind of riling up that we start to see, because radicalization comes from that kind of, pool, if I can say, of energy. And we are going to be seeing far more radicalization and violence coming from climate change as people shift and get permission to be angry and to express their anger, and they are righteous and they're going to save everybody, whether anybody likes it or not. So that's what I want us to be aware of, the consequences of colonization, or colonial thinking at least. And I want you to also understand that we have all been colonized in our history. And we have all been colonizers in our history. We need to really start learning the history from outside of Europe, because I'm very concerned that the colonial conversation in Canada is one of settlers versus Indigenous peoples, and we're not recognizing that all of us immigrated from places in the world that have all been colonized. So if we can start from the common understanding that actually we're all in this together, and we have cultural habits and mindsets that are colonial based regardless of skin color, because we've all been on both sides of that equation. We've been colonized and we have colonized others. It's just, every few centuries it changes into somebody else. And now it's more about corporations and organizations, right? But go back in history and learn the history of Africa and Latin America and Asia and Southeast Asia, right? And other parts of the world. You'll find it's very similar. And it can be disheartening in one way, but at the same time, there's some comfort of, hey, we can figure this out. We have common ground. So I encourage you to form conversations about having human conversations versus settler versus Indigenous versus immigrants versus however we think of that. But if you can have human conversations and invite that. Because my concern is if Indigenous people bring colonial concerns because their own people some of them are colonial, that we won't listen to that because we have not framed our minds to accept that. And that's the danger of us versus them. Okay, so I would just want to really check us on our savior kind of idea that, we got to help our neighbors. Yeah, we don't need to save them. We need to listen. And we need to understand that the same dynamics in our communities exist in theirs. I think you'll go a long way. Okay, so tonight's talk is about decolonizing climate change and lessons from Passover, Easter, and Vaisakhi. I love this time of year. I use these reflections myself in many, many ways, just so you know. So tonight I'm just going to share just like a brief piece from each tradition, or each, moment of significance for the three faiths. So we're going to start with Passover, and I am not an expert, so we just have to be very transparent on that. I am going to give you my understanding as a Sikh, and a very brief, explanation of Passover in the context of the work that we're going to do today. So what I want to bring to attention is, in Passover, it was a time when people who, some of us will say Jewish or Israelites, were being persecuted in Egypt. Right? And there was this edict that the children or, the males were going to be killed. And I guess what I want to do is, rather than getting into the story of that, what I want to bring to your attention is something that happened in that time. So here's this village, or this space, this, geographic area where children are being killed. The boy children are being killed. And so many families lost their children. And it happened. And then there was this one girl, her name was Miriam, and her mother, to save her son, put him into the river, right? And that was as far as she could think of what to do to save her child. But Miriam was different. Miriam went, okay, and she followed her brother, and you just realized that her brother was coming up to the palace, and brings him to the attention, right? And I don't remember what the titles are. Please forgive me. Again, as I said, I'm not the expert. And I don't feel like we have to be experts to learn lessons from our neighbors, right? And that's what I want to also demonstrate. So she takes this moment and brings the baby to the attention of like, oh my gosh, look at this special child, right? To the, can I say queen? And she didn't hesitate. I think this is what really intrigued me, because usually when everyone's telling the story, it's this tiny little piece and then there's this broader, narrative. And yet that's the one that I really glommed onto. I was like, she's a kid, right? Miriam was not an adult. I don't even think she was a tween. She was a child herself who simply, with her gut, saw an opportunity and took action. She didn't stop and think, well, am I okay to do this? Like, is it allowed for me to do this? Is this permissible? Should I go find an adult and ask permission? She didn't. She simply went, hi, look at this baby. And I keep wanting to say the Pharaoh's mom. The Pharaoh's mom falls in love with the baby, right? And is like, oh my gosh, look at this miracle. I'm like, wow. How often do we have these, like we're so sure we have these insights, and then that external world that we're all groomed to, and Miriam was no different. Her world was the same. There's these outside authorities that she was supposed to be obedient to, but she didn't do that. And as a result, Moses lived. Right? And we just kind of gloss over her contribution, which I just find fascinating. But that's the piece that I want us to focus on, because not only did she say, hey, look at this gift, then she's like, oh, well, he probably needs a wet nurse. I know a wet nurse, and brings her mother in to be able to take care of this beautiful baby that is a gift to the Pharaoh's mom. And Moses grows up with royalty and survives and is that fated person, right? But it started because a child took action and didn't question herself, didn't doubt herself. So for your first question, how often, so the way this is going to work is you're going to be partnered up as buddies, and you're all paired up here and online. You will type your responses into the chat. So you will choose partner A and partner B. If you can quickly do that now, partner A, partner B, please. Okay. And you will each have a minute to do, partner A will start, and then partner B will have a minute as well. And to answer this question, which is supposed to be on our screen as well, I believe, and so you can answer any part of these questions. How often do you listen to your inner voice and take action? How often do you look to others for permission to act? Partner A, please begin. is again a very important pillar of colonialism, right? The external authorities. Someone will tell you what to think. And the looking for your answers from within is the non-colonial. And it's an ancient, way of thinking to look within for your answers that you will, if you look back enough far back enough in history in places, you will find it rooted there before they were colonized. This is a part of many ancient traditions. So moving on, next we want to talk about the Pharaoh, right? So Moses and the Pharaoh grew up as brothers. And there's, all kinds of interactions. And what I found interesting was when I was learning about Passover and Moses and the Pharaoh, it was interesting that Moses came to his brother with the concerns that he was seeing about the conditions of the Israelites. And those conversations were reasonable conversations, right? They were said with respect, and can I call them even quiet conversations? But those were brought to the Pharaoh's attention, and they didn't seem to register. He didn't really seem to see the value or the importance of this information that came respectfully to him. And this is a phenomenon we see all over the world today. And we see in our families and we see in our workplaces, right? When people who are in decision-making or authority positions, that quiet voices, when they come to them, very often they're not listening to those voices. But it didn't stay that way. There may have been other very apocalyptic events that took his attention. It's like, oh, something important is happening, right? So my question to you, from looking at it from this Pharaoh perspective, if you are the Pharaoh in your life, you have the ability to change things, right? And you do, because each of you is of that caliber. What does it take for you to acknowledge that you are contributing to a problem? Is it the reasonable voices? Or do you need things to start falling apart? People screaming and marching in the streets. Apocalyptic events happening, which is, we keep calling climate change. Look at all the stuff that's happening, earthquakes and fires and floods. What do you need to understand or start exploring how you are contributing to a problem? Please begin. Partner A. And those online, if you can type your answers into the chat.
I'm not sure. Colonialism, poverty, and all these things, and understanding that it's connected. Then suddenly everything was my fault. And now I don't know where I am. Person B can flip over to person B.
So some of the things to keep in mind is that the idea of a problem has to be a certain size before you in in a leadership role or in a place of impact should pay attention to it is very much a colonial thinking, right? They've got to be screaming this loudly, it's got to be this big. The non-colonial perspective is the prevention methods, right? To be able to actually be proactive and listening and building those relationships. And when a problem arises, to deal with it when it's smaller, because it's so much easier to deal with. And then you're not caught up in that snarl of dysfunction. But if you make people get to this level or a very high level of being outraged and angry, they themselves are not going to be doing a lot of reasonable thinking by that point. But that makes the conflict of colonialism work. So be aware of that habit and of the leadership around you and of yourself, how this happens, like if this happens to you. So moving on into Easter. Easter has 3 components, right? Suffering, death, and rebirth. And I've always found it so fascinating that the suffering piece gets so ignored. It's like this quick little, Jesus of Nazareth suffered for us and we don't have to pay attention to it. That's actually become, can I say, a very common narrative. And yet, when I've sat with this can I say this experience, it's like, but if you don't do the suffering, the rest actually isn't possible. There's no way to get to rebirth because you didn't go through that hard time. It's been deflected. And we can't get to rebirth if we don't start with our suffering. And so I want to explore, what does this mean? Like, to me, and this is my interpretation, and I'm not saying this is anyone else's, so take it for whatever you think it's worth. When I sit with Jesus of Nazareth, who has been nailed to the cross and he's suffering for days, what I see is courage. What I see is endurance. What I see is heart, right? What I see is spirit. And not losing himself in the suffering, right? Not losing his authenticity, not losing his humanity. Because so many people, when they suffer, they constrict. They can become inhumane, right? They can then justify doing atrocities to so many people because don't you know I suffered? And so this is, I find again in the climate change movement, this idea of certain communities, who have been struggling. Very often, saviors will say this to Indigenous populations. Well, you have suffered. And oh, yes, that's why you're small. And of course that's why. And there's almost like an encouragement to stay that way because it's thought of as helpful and they're doing sympathy and empathy. But what they're not seeing was the resilience in that suffering. Like that's not what is often talked about. Right? And so do you do this? When you speak about another community, do you focus on they suffered on this and it cost them this and this was the negative impact? Do you focus on that? Or do you focus on they rose and accomplished this? This is how this community grew. This is how they kept their humanity intact. This is how they did resilience. And I don't see a lot of conversation about resilience happening when we speak of Jesus of Nazareth suffering. Instead, I hear that it's almost like because he did it, we don't have to do it. So I'm going to posit to you that suspiciously sounds like, and I'm not an expert on this, but it does suspiciously sound like colonized thinking. That somewhere in there, people inserted something to their people so that resilience was not what people thought of when they saw Jesus of Nazareth on the cross. So, my question to you is, are you able to sit with your suffering? Are you able to sit with the suffering of the world? Or do you avoid it and distract yourselves? Do you try to save people or fix situations so you can circumvent the suffering? Partner A, please begin. So, suffering, the framework around it. I would say to you that the victim framework around suffering helps colonialism be possible because you're not looking for solutions. You're stuck in a downward spiral. But the resilience mindset of suffering, the idea that this is when you're growing and you're going to expand during this time, that is actually a non-colonial way of thinking of suffering. And the thing is, suffering always has an ending, right? This is the thing that I feel that when we're avoiding suffering, we don't understand. We actually prolong it, I feel. We keep it occurring far longer than it needs to. Suffering always, always has an ending. And that ending is what allows rebirth to be possible. And so we're also uncomfortable with ending, right? Death, relationships ending, jobs ending, status quo ending, and yet change is the one constant we have, right? Isn't that funny? We're so funny as a species. We fight to keep things the way they are rather than becoming comfortable with change, becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? To learn to surf when discomfort comes along. That safety and comfort is stagnation, and feeling confident and safe during discomfort is actually when growth is possible. And so my question to you when it comes to endings, right? Because Jesus of Nazareth ended that journey. That suffering definitely ended. And I think he got that. That's where, like, when I sit with the Easter story, I'm in awe of the resilience he demonstrated, the strength and authenticity and the commitment to his humanity that he demonstrated. And then the ending, how graceful that was. There wasn't a fighting of it. There wasn't a why me. There wasn't a, the fear of where it was. There's an acceptance. Everything ends. And there's a peace in that. Relationships are going to end. Jobs are going to change. Industries are going to change. The status quo will change. Therefore, the old status quo will end. And I feel that he really exemplified how gracefully that we can accept endings, because then rebirth is possible. And this is the power of Easter. Like I said, these Passover, Easter, Vaisakhi, they're all around the same time of the year, every year, and they are powerful, powerful times of self-reflection if we allow ourselves to sit in that. And it's more than chocolates and Easter bunnies and coloring contests, right? Though those are fun. So, ending. What do you need to end in order to make room for taking action for climate change? Or level up your efforts for climate change? What no longer serves you? And I feel at the rate that we're going, we can go 2 minutes each. This is moving a lot quicker. Yeah, I've been keeping an eye on the time. So 2 minutes each to talk.
Kristen B. And back to Sukhvinder.
So, endings. I think the reason we struggle with starting new things and the reasons we're struggling with climate change is that we actually haven't taken the time to sit with the suffering of climate change, to sit with what needs to end. What I'm observing is there's a lot of lecturing, so that sermonizing that I was talking about when we first started the evening. There's a lot of talk, but we're not doing the inner work of what needs to end in order to make room for the new. And then the other part of I would say that clinging to status quo, clinging to and believing that comfort equals safety, that those again are pillars of colonization, right? They really help clip people's wings and they help people stay stagnant and they help people then look outside themselves for solutions and to the authorities to figure things out because they're not allowed to be wrong, right? However, and the pursuit of perfection, right? Because that's you're not going to end anything when you're busy trying to be perfect, and you don't have time for suffering. You got to be perfect. That pursuit of perfection is also a colonial thinking. And so be aware as you're out and about, is that person attacking that person and saying, oh, you're not perfect, therefore we don't have to listen to you. That's a key behavior in colonial thinking. If you're not perfect enough, we don't need to listen to your words. And that is said to communities, it's said to individuals, it's said to organizations, because nobody's perfect. And it's a very easy way of dismissing a whole group of people. So now we've ended what we need to end. Now rebirth is possible, right? Now possibilities are possible. And I feel one of the things, though, that we fall into the trap of thinking is that ending is clean, very definitive, and very like, it's done. There usually is a transition period, right? We've identified what needs to go. We know what we want to bring in, and there's a transition period. And that goes back to if we had sat with our suffering and built up our muscles of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, then that transition is possible, right? But for a lot of people, that's also uncomfortable, and so therefore that's bad, and so we're not going to do that. So we fight for, like, this has to go away for this to exist. And let's be honest, that's a very common way of framing climate change. This has got to go to make room for this. And yet, creation is expansive. It's about the and conversation. So I would say to you that the or conversation is a colonial mindset. The and conversation is the non-colonial conversation or mindset, right? So as we look at rebirth, I kind of feel like I'm missing a question, and I feel like I want to ask it. Maybe we can do a minute on it each, but the transitioning, and there's a reason why in labor we have transition. Yes, and those who have been pregnant and have given birth, they know transition's hard. But without it, you can't do birth. So can we focus on transition for just a little bit, for a minute each if you can? And my question to you, so it's not, I don't have it posted because I'm going to make the questions up as we do this, because this is also the and in work, right? Transition. Do you need endings to be definitive? They've got to have like it's got to be done before you can start? Or can you be working on kind of tying up this space, right? Shifting as you're doing this and welcoming in that new thinking or new options and new possibilities. Can you be okay that both are existing on the same plane of existence? Please begin. Whatever you understood of that question, please answer.
Should I do 2 minutes?
1 minute. Yeah. There's no slide. I just made the question up. And it's uncomfortable, isn't it? So now we're at rebirth. And that's that spring conversation, that lovely energy we all love, right? We're coming out of winter. And we go, oh, that's so awesome. You know, we celebrate with chocolate and everything else. But I find sometimes with rebirth, we're not actually mindful of what we're birthing. We can get caught up in that lovely energy or new possibilities. And I see this also in climate change, right? Amazing ideas and oh, that sounds so great. And it's such a lovely space and hopeful space to be in. And, because it's not an or conversation, and we need the mindfulness of how are we going to shape this energy? What are we creating, keeping transition in mind, right? That transition is what gets us from ending to rebirth, to ending the old and starting something new. So for yourselves, my question to you is this. What do you need to create or give birth to in order to take action for climate change or to level up your efforts for climate change? Right? What do you need to create or give birth to? 2 minutes. Please begin partner A.
Person B can share now.
So this ends our part of our journey that's focused on Easter, and I'm going to have a shift over now to Vaisakhi, which was, is a time of great significance to myself as a Sikh and other Sikhs. I'm not going to give you the colonial version because there's definitely a colonial version of Vaisakhi. That's the one where you eat till you go, you're full, and we unfortunately feed the well-fed, which is the unfortunate part. And we have this, there's this sort of concept of purity that got inserted in definitely with British colonialism into Vaisakhi. What I want to talk to you about is what happened, what led to it, and what are the lessons that we can learn? Because what a lot of us colonized Sikhs have forgotten is that Sikhi began as a response to the colonization of the Indian subcontinent by the Mughals. That's where Sikhi began. It's why we are a social justice, spiritual path, a way of life, and we're not a religion, which I gotta tell you, confused the British like crazy, and they really tried to make us into a religion. And I think they succeeded to a certain part. That's that decolonizing that we're all working on, or some of us are working on. So Vaisakhi, what had happened was, when Sikhi began, we had this wave of teachers. They were called Masands, and they were women and men. This is in the early 1500s when this happened, okay? So they were women and men, and they were, to be like really transparent, they were like part judiciary because social justice, right? The justice element, and part spiritual teacher because spirituality and justice for us, that's what that means. You can't separate that out for us. It's such a deep part of who we are, of the Sikh path, not the British Sikhism. So the Masands got created, the system grew. I mean, in the 1500s, we had the equivalent of like 4 female, just to give you a sense of like what this system was. It was multi-gendered, and we had at least 4 female Supreme Court justice / bishop kind of position. And the rest of those same positions were filled by men. And so this system that, when we in the West now, oh, wow, that's so progressive. Your women were in positions of authority, and it's the 1500s. And I'm like, yeah. But, it didn't seem to matter what the gender, balance or contributions were. Because unfortunately, over time, enough of that system became corrupt because they're human, right? And so where it went from uplifting people and helping people learn to really embrace their own inner authority, their own inner power, some of them, it wasn't everybody, but it was enough. Enough of them turned that into, you will do as I say, right? I will tell you. And so they inserted themselves as a barrier between that person and source. Whereas the point of the Masand system was to help people interface directly with source. So for us, Vaisakhi is about an ending. It's about ending that Masand system, which had become corrupt enough. And it's fascinating how the colonial story is about, well, it became financially corrupt. They stole money, right? Really, I want to say making it this petty story about money, because if you have to talk about accountability and integrity, it's a very powerful ending for us. But then, there's a lot of colonial Sikhs that would be struggling with that, right? So just be aware when you're hearing people and what they tell you about Vaisakhi. Is it that petty story, or is it that really deep non-colonial story of accountability and not doing dysfunction, right? The Masands had become dysfunctional. And isn't this what we struggle with, that idea of change? So if it's not working, stop doing it. And that's what Guru Gobind Singh did, our 10th Guru and our last Guru. He ended it. And I'm sure that the same kinds of humans today existed then. I'm sure there were those that were going, you can't do that. This is tradition. It began with this Guru, and we've done it for how long? You can't do that. And the answer is, yes, we can. If it doesn't work, stop. It needs to end. Its time is done. So Vaisakhi for us is the ending and the beginning. So that is where we call it the birth of the Khalsa. So this is what I'm saying about the colonial story. We're going to talk about the birth, but we're actually not going to talk about what we ended so that we can get clear on what we were creating And then you can muck up that story, right? It's this brotherhood of the pure. And I'm like, And so why were women added onto this? Right? Very patriarchal, the colonial story of Vaisakhi. So the thing is, Vaisakhi happened a certain way, where the 10th Guru came out to the Sikhs, of which there were thousands of them there at that time. And he asked for someone, he says, I need a sacrifice. I need someone to sacrifice themselves to begin this path for us. And what I find fascinating are the 5 people that turn by turn stood up and what each of their name meant. Because when you look at the order they came, they actually give you the recipe to become the self-sovereign, okay, which is what a Khalsa person is. This is a person where the buck stops at them. They are in charge of their life. They take that responsibility seriously. And it's why I wear the sthad, a turban on my head, because it indicates to you that I am a sovereign person of myself, so the buck stops with me, and you're going to hold me accountable to that. It's a visible sign for you to hold me accountable and to identify me in a crowd of tens of thousands, right? So the first person who stood up, his name meant compassion. So not that wimpy compassion. His name was Dea, okay? Compassion. Dea means to be connected to everything and everyone around you. It's a vast, infinite feel of compassion. So it's not the performative, right? That kind of superficial kindness, look how compassionate I'm being for people. It's a deep connection where you feel everything and everyone around you. And it is very uncomfortable because you feel pain and you feel joy and you feel it on that vast scale. So my first question to you is this. Do you allow yourself to feel fully? Do you dial down your emotions or avoid them? Do you disconnect from those around you? 2 minutes, please begin. Okay, just going forward, we're going to do a minute each for the remaining questions. Okay. Okay, so we started with compassion, right? Compassion was the first person that stood up. The second person, their name meant justice, which makes actually sense, doesn't it? If you feel and are connected with everything and everyone around you, you're going to feel the joys and you're going to feel the sorrows, and you're going to see the inequity and you're going to see the disparities, and you're going to want to do something about that because you're plugged in, right? And so justice stood up. And the thing is, as humans, there are a lot of struggles when it comes to justice. And so I'd like you to spend some time with some of these questions about how we struggle with justice, right? So my next question to you is this, or questions are, who do you think does not deserve human decency? Right? Because we do that as people. We decide who doesn't deserve justice. So who do you think does not deserve human decency? Who do you think does not count? And who do you think deserves what they get, that they asked for it? Please begin. Partner A. So when we have that sort of hunger for justice, we then, the next person, the third person that stood up, their name meant courage, which also then makes sense, doesn't it? Because if we feel everything, we see the disparities, we're going to want to do something about it, right? But courage also, like, it has these colonial shadow side, right? And we have, can I say, the courage that comes from sheer agony, and it's almost about like vomiting that agony on somebody else, right? So it's that screaming and that punishing, and so that action that they're taking is more punitive. But people see that as courage. That's why I want to just, differentiate between this. And then there's, the courage of like being really grounded and certain. Actually, sorry, certainty is wrong. I apologize, but being grounded. Because you're going to be uncertain. You're kind of going to go, I don't know what's happening, but I'm going to take that step anyways. And you move and you lean into discomfort, and you lean into curiosity, and you lean into possibility, right? And you lean into, I don't need to know everything. We will figure it out if we keep taking the steps, right? So there's that kind of courage. And the thing is, there's a lot of things that can stop us from being courageous. So these are the questions I'd like you to focus on. Do you make decisions and take actions based on what people think about you? Are you able to do the hard work regardless of what people think about you? Because what others think can really stifle our courage. Please begin. Partner A, 1 minute. And those online, if you can continue to post your answers. So when we have compassion, justice, and courage, these three are a really unstable mix. There's a lot of people that spectacularly go wrong and implode or explode, right? Because you're feeling everything and everyone around you. You see the disparity. You're going to do something, and you're taking action. And so this is why the fourth person stood up at this time and not any earlier. And this person's name meant self-discipline. Right? That's that very unsexy part to being our own self-sovereign, right? Self-sovereignty is not possible without self-discipline. It's a containment. So then it becomes, rather than this raging out of control fire of compassion, justice, and courage, what you have is a harnessed fire that's creative and strong and sustainable, because it's housed in self-discipline. And there's lots of things that I want to say sandbag our self-discipline. So my questions to you are, how do you manage your anger, disappointments, hurt feelings, and resentments? Right? Because these can really talk very loudly to us and convince us that we don't need to practice self-discipline. We should live at the mercy of these emotions. And how do you stop yourself from playing victim Olympics when that's so encouraged by human society and has been for thousands of years? Person A, please begin. And so we're moving on to self-sovereign, because that was the name of the last person that stood up, right? And that makes sense because, you're going to own yourself and for the buck to stop at you, to be a whole person, to be grounded, you got to be connected to everyone around us. We have to be open to seeing the injustice and the disparity around us. We have to have the courage to make a difference. And we need the self-discipline to hold all that together so that we can be wise. Right? So, my questions to you are, do you own yourself fully? Does the buck stop at you? If not, who owns you? Who do you blame when things don't work out? Person A, please begin. Okay. So this concludes our journey part. And actually, right before we conclude, I do want to say one last thing. It's the idea of what does leadership look like? What does that self-ownership look like? I would say the colonial version of leadership is the tyrant. It's the person who thinks being a leader is about imposing on other people. And so very often we think tyrant and we think of the aggressive tyrant. But I want you to be aware of the passive-aggressive tyrant too, right? They're far more prevalent, and they're so proud about how they don't do conflict, but they'll stick you, right? Stab you in the back. They're so proud of that because they don't do aggression. So I want you to keep that in mind, right? That's tyranny, and that's the colonial definition of leader. The non-colonial definition of leadership is leadership of self. It's just really that simple. And then that's an ancient teaching you will find at the root of so many spiritual paths. And so I leave you with this. It's the last question for yourselves, and then we will switch to the Q&A. And it's the call to action to you. As you go forward into your life, as you leave here at the end of the day, or you sign off from this call, what colonial habit are you going to shift? 1 minute each, please. And for those online, if you can post that, please.
gather everyone's attention back here at the front. I think we have maybe 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes for Q&A.
Sorry I took over time. That's on me.
No, that's on us. We've gone over time every speaker.
Okay.
So I believe Yvonne will have the microphone here if anyone in the room with us wants to ask a question of our speaker. If you are online at home, please type your questions in the chat here where me and Michael can see them. And yeah, Michael, do you have a question to start us off
I'm
with?
going to pick up on a question that came through in the chat earlier, which leads to a bigger question perhaps. And that relates to capitalism and its place. Does capitalism place the onus on the individual to take action rather than take collective responsibility for system change? I'm kind of weaving my own interpretation with the reference to capitalism here, but when we've been talking about actions, we've been very much centered on ourselves because that's where we begin. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we individually move into collective system change.
I think it depends on your relationship with capitalism and how you define it, right? There are people who just look at capitalism as an opportunity to be financially abundant. And then they take that abundance and they finance change with it. Like I seem to find a lot of business people, that's the business people I know and frankly hang out with. They'll be the ones that'll be like, oh, that's a great idea, great. We can fund it. You don't have to ask permission. And so I guess as a Sikh, for me, I feel it's about reframing the question, that it's not about capitalism, it's how you want to show up.
How you want to what?
Show up, okay? Because I feel the question of like, framing it like capitalism is a problem, because that's a common narrative that I've heard in Canada, puts us into that victim-oppressor role. So I want to shift it into the more self-sovereign ownership of self role. And really it comes down to how do I want to show up? So in Sikhi, we have some teachings that are taught in threes. And one of them is Kirt Karna, Vand Shakna, Nam Japna. And Kirt Karna means earn an honest, abundant living. Vand Shakna means share what you earn. And Nam Japna means have a practice that constantly keeps you in touch with everything and everyone around you, including Source. So when you're connected like that, your earning is different than a disconnected person. But yet connected people are in capital, like they practice, I don't know if I can say they practice capitalism, but they're in that system and they're doing really well and making a lot of changes, right? Funding all kinds of things without having to ask anyone permission. So wouldn't you like to be able to see a change and fund it and not have to go ask an external authority for permission and funding? Because I feel that's that patriarchy piece, right? That someone else has the money. So that's what I would say about it. It's reframing it.
And I also had a question written down. This one's a bit of a switching back to another part. When you were talking about rebirth, and also the question we kind of added in just before rebirth, one thing me and Michael talked about was what does that just world and that just climate transition actually look like? Because a lot of us, particularly those of us kind of steeped in this colonial understanding of the climate crisis, we spend a lot of time on no's. Like, I can tell you what won't be there. I can say no to a lot of things. But what about that sort of positive imagining? What happens for you when you try to turn to that?
We need to be practical and pragmatic. And I think labor, again, of giving birth to children tells you it's messy. It's moment by moment. It's a commitment that you're recommitting to in each moment. I'm committing to justice. I'm going to be just in this moment. And oh, I fell off. Okay, well, I can come back. I'm so sorry. I should not have done that. I won't. And then you change, right? And again, I think it's that reframing of it, of stepping out of what can it perfectly look like? Because what we're really asking is, how do we do this without feeling pain? And I'm so sorry to say to you, it's going to be uncomfortable. Your level of pain is up to you. It's messy. So what if we could be okay with messy? We were so okay when we were kids. Did we not? And somewhere in here, we had that smacked out of us and kind of, carved into a box, fit into here. It's messy. If we can be at peace with that, it's going to be imperfect. And we will fail. What if we could change our relationship with failure? What if we can instead go, oh, wow, I got out of integrity right there. What brought me to that? Okay, that's what I got to work on. Because failure are those powerful moments of insight for ourselves. But the colonial piece is imperfection, must be perfect, you don't count. And we're so busy trying to count. But from Sikhi, I can tell you, we're born counting. It's just that's who we are. We have to give that away to the world that's asking for it. But we're born with it. It's ours to give to someone else. The fact that we count and that we have impact. Messiness, discomfort. So I would say let's learn to surf. To become, right? We'll be able to move and that. I practice, I cannot tell you, that imagery of surfing has helped me through so many times because I have felt swamped out of left field by waves of, difficulty and challenge. And I'd be like, okay, get back on that surfboard, and I'm going to kind of wobble my way through this. Yeah.
Sukhvinder, you've given us a rich evening. I've been on a steep learning curve and engagement and have had a wonderful conversationalist here. And if nothing else, I realize that I really like using passive-aggressive behavior.
We all, to be honest, it feels good, doesn't it? Ha ha.
That said, of the many things that have come across tonight, that there's a couple particularly I just want to reference as we conclude, is that climate change, engaging it, mustn't be an either-or. It's got to be and, as we go into conversations about climate change. And it also relates to that discussion we had about courage as well and action, that we need the courage to act, recognizing uncertainty. If we're recognizing uncertainty, we're also opening up to being changed ourselves. We've got to change the plans we're working on. And as a saying I've often used is, it's important to stick to your principles, not to your answers. Because as you do things together, you're reframing the best way of acting as well. So personally, I want to thank you so much, and I'm sure on part of everybody who was here tonight and online. We got a lot of
Thank you. I just want to add one piece that's got to do with us down here, and I'll have that be my last thing. We have to understand collateral damage to our actions. Right? So the pipeline protests where people were like, we're going to break Canada. It was happening all over the country, right, for the Northern Gas Line pipeline. I'm born and raised in Northern BC. I know exactly what rural communities are like and the lack of services. And so what I want to share with you is as those protests were happening here, right, on Cambie and 41st, or on the SkyTrains and all of those places, I was getting messages from Indigenous friends of how Indigenous women were being attacked by settler men as punishment for these protests. And I'm like, I felt so upset about the arrogance and the just not caring about the consequences of these protests. And nobody talked about that. I had Indigenous friends pass that information on of the attacks that had happened. And not one person, as that pipeline was put on hold, I didn't hear any climate change person talk about, okay, so the millions of dollars that were going to be raised by this pipeline plan that Indigenous peoples have agreed to up north so they can fund drinking water, fund actual medical clinics, fund schools for their children, help deal with, their missing and murdered Indigenous women. We're going to give you the $1 million this way. But settlers were so righteous that they were going to save these Indigenous people from the corporations. And they didn't treat the Indigenous nations up north as if they were financially savvy. But yet, isn't it funny? You and I can buy land here and develop it and put houses on it, and we can make money, but they can't develop their land. That's forbidden. We're going to save you from that. So I'm going to say that to you. You go out there. This is real. This is real work. You're impacting, and you're causing collateral damage. So as you do your solutions, as we talked about the 3 things you mentioned, to also factor in, is this our ego that is so, like we're so adamant we think we know what's best? Did we actually go up north and ask those nations? Because none of us in the Lower Mainland did. But we were very loud in our screaming, and the government listened and put that on hold. And I wonder how many people died due to lack of medical care, lack of shelter, lack of water.
I think we've opened up a whole nother conversation and program. Olivia, over to you to sign off.
Yeah, we have a lot of food for thought coming out of this one, and I just want to thank everyone for being here, the people in the room, as well as the people online and the people who I know will watch this after tonight. Thank you for being here in the future. Also, I want to draw our attention once again to our co-sponsors. Thank you to the Multi-Faith Action Society, and also to the Tyee, our media sponsor. And also, April 13th is our next event. It will be 4 of our members of this congregation, so we will be hearing from the Unitarian perspective, and it should be a great one. And thank you all again.
Who are climate arrestees.
Yes, who are climate arrestees who, one of whom just got out of jail, so we scheduled everything perfect. She just got out of jail and we got her immediately on a speaking gig. I can't wait to see you all there. All right, thank you everyone so much.